also, let's go ahead and fill in the entire unit circle. Everything that we write on here is what you will need to memorize, and you will have to be able to practice this so that you can develop the unit circle a couple of times and then eventually be able to memorize it and know it off the top of your head. Okay, so let's start with going through and filling out all of the degrees first, and then we'll go back and fill out the radians. So in quadrant 1 we have 0 degrees, 30, 45, and 60, because these are unnecessary, and then 90. Quadrant 2 we have 120, 135, 150, and then at the halfway mark 180. In quadrant 3 we have 210, 225, and 240. And at the 3/4 mark we have 270. And then quadrant 4 we have 300, 315, and 330. And right back where we started at 360. Okay, next we'll go around and do radians. So this would be 0 pi, pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3, which is the same as 2 pi over 6. At 90 degrees we have pi over 2, which is the same as 3 pi over 6 and 2 pi over 4. At 120 we have 2 pi over 3, which is the same as 4 pi over 6. At 135 we have 3 pi over 4, and at 150 we have 5 pi over 6. At 180 degrees we have pi, which could also be 4 pi over 4 or 6 pi over 4. So remember that when we did this first, we counted by pi over 4s and we counted by pi over 6s, and then we went back and reduced everything. Okay, in quadrant 3 we have 7 pi over 6, 5 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 3, which would be the same as 8 pi over 6. And at 270 we have 9 pi over 6 or 6 pi over 4, which is the same as 3 pi over 2. In quadrant 4 we have 10 pi over 6, which reduces to 5 pi over 3, and 11 pi over 6, and then 12 pi over 6, which reduces to 2 pi. And then the last multiple of pi over 4 is 7 pi over 4, and at 2 pi that would be the same as 8 pi over 4. Okay, so if we go back we can fill in all of our coordinates. First we can go through and do the multiples of 45. Those are the easiest. So I'm going to just put one triangle in this circle. Okay, so remember that on that one, the side lengths were square root of 2 over 2. For the 45, 45, 90. So that means my coordinates would be root 2 over 2 and root 2 over 2. And then I can reflect that into quadrant 2. In quadrant 2, it would be negative root 2 over 2, and then positive for my y. In quadrant 3, both of them would be negative, And then in quadrant 4, x would be positive and y would be negative. Okay, so we have all of our multiples of 45. Next, let's do 30, 60, 90. And you're not required to draw these triangles in yours. All right, so that would be my 30, 60, 90, which means that across from my 30 would be my short leg, or 1/2, and across from the 60 would be my long leg, or my square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so my coordinates at pi over 6, or 30 degrees, are going to be root 3 over 2 and 1/2. I'm going to reflect that into quadrant 2. So my x value will be negative and y will be positive. In quadrant 3, both will be negative. And in quadrant 4, my x value will be positive and my y value will be negative. Alright, so now I have the multiples of 45, I have the multiples of 60. I'm going to go back and do multiples of 30. Now I'm going to go back and do multiples of 60. Okay, so there's my 60-degree angle at the bottom, 30 degrees at the top. So across from the short leg, or across from the 30 would be the short leg, so that side length is 1/2. And across from the 60 would be the long leg, which is square root of 3 over 2. So my x and y coordinates will be 1/2 and square root of 3 over 2. Then I can reflect those into quadrant 2, negative 1/2, square root of 3 over 2. I'm going to reflect that into quadrant 3. Both of the values will now be negative. And in quadrant 4, x is going to be positive and y is going to be negative. Okay, so those are all the values from the special right triangles: 30, 60, 90, 60, 30, 90, and 45, 45, 90. So the last things that we have left to fill in are actually the easiest. And remember that this is a unit circle, so at the top again you might want to go ahead and write that. In a unit circle, the radius is always equal to 1. And that's how we're able to use our special right triangles to come up with those measurements and the x and y coordinates. Okay, so that means that at 0 degrees, my x coordinates are 1, 0. At 180, it's negative 1, 0. At 90 degrees, it's 0, 1. And at 270, it's 0, negative 1. Okay, so that is everything except for the triangles. You don't have to draw those inside, but you do need to be able to state the degrees, the radians, and the x and y coordinates for everything that's on the unit circle.